Hi, this is Rick Levine with your mid-month update for May of 2019. I'm talking to you today on the full moon on May 18th, but I'd like to bring you up to date over the last couple of days because we've been through some pretty dramatic shifts so that we can follow them up through the full moon today and all the way up through the end of the month. So looking back toward May 15th, we had both Venus and Mars changing signs. Venus moved from Aries into Taurus, slowing the energy down a bit. But interestingly enough, when Venus moved into Taurus, it was within range of its conjunction to Uranus, and the exact Venus-Uranus conjunction is today on the day of the full moon. In fact, it's just within a few hours of the full moon itself. So the second thing is that on May 15th, we also had Mars moving from Gemini into Cancer. And it's interesting because both the movement of Mars into Cancer and the movement of Venus into Taurus, both of those energies are slowing down a bit because Venus in Aries was moving faster than Venus in Taurus, even though we do have a few-day window of that Venus in Taurus hitting Uranus and kind of accentuating the energy. That'll begin to settle down in the days to come. In fact, by the 19th, 20th, 21st, after the full moon, that energy will settle down quite a bit. So we'll be left with Venus in Taurus and Mercury and the Sun in Taurus, all kind of more settled and stayed, if you will. And on top of that, Mars, which has been bouncing around in Gemini, Mars on the 15th of May also moved into a Cancer, and Mars in Cancer is a lot more settled. It's a less aggressive energy. It's more about waiting for things to come rather than going out to get them. Mars in Cancer, though, does express its anger and or its aggression based upon how it's feeling. There's definitely a connection between the emotions and how we move forward. And that Mars in Cancer, though, for the rest of the month, certainly does slow the energies down a bit. Now, I'd like to look at the actual full moon itself. And the full moon is in Scorpio. The moon actually moved into Scorpio on the 16th. That would have been on Thursday. And today on the 18th, the moon is full at 5:11 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 2:11 on the West Coast. But Venus actually joins up with Uranus exactly at 12:16 p.m. That's midday on the East Coast. So that's 9 o'clock, 9:15 in the morning here in Seattle. This full moon is a very interesting full moon because, first of all, the Scorpio full moon every year is interesting. This is sometimes called the Buddha full moon. Buddha was born and allegedly left his body also on the Scorpio full moon. The Scorpio full moon is interesting because Scorpio is complex. Scorpio does the deep dive into emotions. It wants to go beneath the surface. It wants to get to the core, to the root of things, because that's where transformation happens. And the Scorpio moon, Scorpio as a sign, is really about transformation. The thing is that the Scorpio full moon is exactly opposite the sun in Taurus, and Taurus is not interested in transformation. Taurus is interested in holding the energy as it is. Taurus is to simplicity as Scorpio is to complexity. And so we have this dichotomy or this awareness between the part of us that knows how things are and wants to hold our position and keep them the way they are, and the part of us that really is willing to go down deep and to do whatever is necessary in order to create profound and lasting and total transformation or change, metamorphosis, if you will. Now, the other thing about this full moon is that the sun is conjunct Mercury within a couple of degrees, which means that the full moon is also opposite Mercury. This brings in a whole intellectual, mental functioning, and there's a sense here that that energy of the full moon, again, because Mercury is involved, Mercury being the messenger of the gods, Mercury being the only planet that can cross back and forth between the conscious and the unconscious, Mercury being the psychopomp, not losing its memory or its form as it goes from the conscious realms into the unconscious realms. And therefore, Mercury becomes a key player in this full moon, because Mercury is how we go into the unconscious. We use words to express what's hidden and to bring things out into the open. In fact, this Mercury is also harmonizing, as is the sun widely, harmonizing with Pluto and Saturn in Capricorn. Remember, we have this Pluto-Saturn conjunction that is now, both Pluto and Saturn are retrograde, and that conjunction is widening. And then when both Saturn and Pluto turn direct, these two planets will move toward a conjunction next January, January of 2020. But meanwhile, this full moon is sextile to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and the Sun and Mercury are trining it. And so there's this sense of this week, this full moon, this culmination of the energy, we kind of have an opportunity to look ahead at some of the transformations that may be occurring over the next 7-8 months, and to put some pieces into place now that will allow us more smoothly to move through these very profound changes that are occurring both individually and collectively as we hit this 3 times a century Saturn-Pluto conjunction next January. So this moon is pretty strong, pretty powerful. We also have, at this full moon, Mercury forming a quincunx with Jupiter. And I think this speaks to the part of us that is trying to figure out how much is enough, how much is too much. When Mercury and Jupiter connect up with a quincunx, there's this uncertainty about how much to say, about bringing things out into the open and whoops, I said too much, or talking and coming up with an idea and then kind of taking it 2 steps further and making it bigger and bigger, almost like blowing up a balloon until it pops. And so it's important to be able to stand back from our tendencies to make things large, to make things grand right now, and to stand back from that so that we don't inflate our good ideas right out of existence. Now, as we move on from today's full moon, by this evening, the moon moves into Sagittarius. It moves into Sagittarius at 9:20 p.m., and that's Eastern time. And pretty much the energy is relatively stable, if you will, through Monday, when we have Venus forming a square and a half with Jupiter. Now, what happens when Venus forms the square and a half with Jupiter, again, the tendency is to overdo, to overindulge. It's Venus now rather than Mercury, and so we need to watch ourselves about how much we eat or how much we drink or how much we just laze around and don't do anything. I mean, for many people, Monday is a back-to-work day, and with Venus forming that sesquisquare to Jupiter, there is a tendency to maybe create another day of Sunday, another day of laziness, and maybe not do the work that we really need to do. As we move to Tuesday, the 21st, the moon moves into Capricorn, and the Sun and Mercury together move into Gemini. Now, this is like a changing of the astrological month. And this is significant because the energy had been very steady, even with the Venus conjunct Uranus that occurred around the time of the full moon. Even with that kind of excitement or the need to want things that are different and out of the box, to express what's in our heart, regardless of whether or not it fits into what we should be doing. With that exception, the fact that Venus, Uranus, Mercury, and the Sun have all been in Taurus, there's a kind of sense of steadiness of energy. And on Tuesday, the Sun and Mercury line up, and this is a superior conjunction of Mercury to the Sun, meaning that Mercury is on the far side of the Sun. Mercury is moving direct. If it was on the near side of the Sun, between Earth and the Sun, then Mercury would be retrograde. So Mercury is moving direct and lined up with the Sun as they both move into Gemini on Tuesday morning. And this is a focus of the Sun, which is our concentration, our will, our consciousness, our awareness, and Mercury, how we communicate, how we talk. Now, what's interesting is that the Sun almost blots out Mercury because we can't see Mercury because the Sun is between it and Mercury, and yet that mercurial function of communication, of interaction, of words and thoughts and ideas is actually getting out past the Sun. And so this is a really powerful time to use words with intent in order to get our ideas out into the open. By Wednesday, the moon moving through Capricorn lines up with Saturn and Pluto, and we may get, this is Wednesday afternoon into the evening, a little bit of intensity as the moon lines up with Saturn and Pluto, kind of a feeling perhaps like we have to get serious, we have more work to do than we can handle, perhaps maybe we hit a wall of some sort, that would be Saturn. And yet when the moon lines up with Pluto late night, there's a sense of breakthrough and maybe a sense of really going to a point where everything changes. Now on Thursday, the moon moves into Aquarius Thursday midday. Actually, it's at 1:49 p.m. The moon moves into Aquarius, and this kind of opens our thinking a bit. It enables us to kind of move beyond the rules of Saturn and perhaps even make some breakthroughs. But we now have Mercury forming a square and a half, a sesquisquare with Saturn, which again is a readjustment of our logic. Maybe what we communicated a few days ago and with the Sun lining up with Mercury, and a couple days before that with that Mercury forming the sesquisquare with Jupiter, maybe there was a sense of we realize we've overdone it and now we need to pull in and kind of pay the piper, or maybe follow through with the hard work that we didn't do earlier. By Friday, Mercury forms that sesquisquare with Pluto. Remember, Thursday it's with Saturn, and on Friday it's with Pluto. And here the energy becomes more intense. Our communication perhaps goes a notch deeper. We maybe have to deal with things that we have brought up over the past few days. And it's a time where perhaps we have to contend with the ramifications, with the consequences of what we said a few days ago or what we are saying now. On Sunday, very early in the morning at 2 a.m. Eastern Time, the moon moves into Pisces. We still have a Saturn influence throughout the day, with the Sun forming a square and a half with Saturn and Mercury forming a biquintile with Saturn. And so there's the sense of Saturn creating boundaries. And yet, midday, 3:30, 3:38, In the afternoon, this is on Monday, the moon forms a conjunction with Neptune. And even with all that Saturnian energy, it's almost like we have a few hours where we feel like we can dream anything, or even if we have heavy responsibilities, that would be Saturn. Perhaps we have maybe a long lunch, or we spend some time outside, but in some way we make a break from the restraints and responsibilities of Saturn, and we go into the realms of fantasy. On Tuesday afternoon, 2:31 p.m., the moon moves into Aries, and this starts the entire emotional cycle, kind of like sends it around again. Aries is the first sign of the zodiac. Here we're making a break, we're pushing into something new. On Tuesday, that moon moving into Aries is really the only significant astrological event of the day. And so we may feel a bit almost like we're able, we're free. That's not quite the word I'm looking for. Unencumbered by so much other stuff that we've been dealing with, that now we actually get to take that step into the new world, into the new territory, into the new project. It's like we have a sense of completion and we're ready to move on into new spaces. Wednesday is a busy day because we have the sun forming a square and a half with Pluto, which is a deeper energy. That's the intensity. But we also have in the evening Mercury forming a square with Neptune. Now, Mercury-Neptune is an interesting combination. We had quite a bit of Mercury-Neptune in the conjunction phase back in March, when Mercury, moving through Pisces, joined with Neptune, retrograded back over that point, and hung out there for a couple of weeks toward the end of March, beginning of April, and then moved on. Mercury and Neptune together are a weird combination because Mercury is logical, Mercury is rational, Mercury is data, it's information. On the other hand, Neptune is dreams. Neptune is imagination rather than information. And so when Mercury is square to Neptune, squares are conflicts. Squares are dynamic stress or tension. And when Mercury is square to Neptune, it's like we try to be specific. We try to say what we mean. We try to mean what we say. And yet Neptune sneaks in and people either misunderstand us or we misspeak. It's not like the Mercury retrograde energy where the misspeaking is an accident or we just have a slip of a tongue. Here we actually have a hard time defining things because Neptune it puts a diffusion filter. It fuzzes out, like in Photoshop there's a Gaussian blur that makes something that's very closely, tightly in focus, and it just blurs everything out. And that's what the Mercury square to Neptune does. It creates a bit of a blur, which makes it harder to get definition and harder to say things that have exact and specific meaning. By Thursday, we have the energy is on Wednesday and Thursday, it's very busy planetarily. On Thursday, we have Mercury in the morning making a contact, a half a square with Uranus, and this is more sharper energy. It's like we're recovering from yesterday's daydream. And the morning energy with Mercury and Uranus is exacting, and it's like the lightning strikes and we get a flash of inspiration or clarity, and then we go to communicate it. But we still have Saturn in the picture, Mercury quincunxing Saturn, and so even still there can be a bit of a struggle in trying to establish boundaries or trying to figure out what we're saying. We're trying to figure out how what we are saying fits into the existing structures, rules, or the situation in which we are talking. The other thing that happens on Thursday the 30th is that Venus makes a sextile with Neptune, and now those fantasies that were difficult yesterday, the imagination that was kind of fuzzing out our thinking and making it difficult for us to use words, today it's okay. We're willing to dream. We're okay to go there because this Venus-Neptune connection is cooperative, and so it's almost like we can enjoy our fantasies. We can enjoy going off into the ethers, and we might even overdo it because by late in the day, by 11 o'clock at night, Mercury is exactly opposed Jupiter. And again, Mercury and Jupiter together are making mountains out of molehills. Mercury and Jupiter together, basically, it overinflates, it expands. Jupiter expands and Mercury is our intellect. So we might have a little bit of an idea that we turn into an entire philosophy. And again, it's like blowing a balloon up so big that we lose the structure as the balloon pops. We need to pay attention so that we don't overextend or overdo or take a good idea and turn it into something so big and so complex that it loses its impact. On the 31st, the last day of the month, the moon moves into Taurus very early in the morning, actually just after midnight on the East Coast, so that would be late on Thursday night here on the West Coast. But at 12:42 a.m. on the East Coast, the moon moves into Taurus. And then by the mid-morning, that moon catches up with Uranus. Uranus has kind of moved along. Remember, it moved into Taurus just back a couple months ago, and now it's at 4 degrees of Taurus. And so as the moon moves into Taurus just after midnight, by 9:30, it's actually lined up. And again, these are Eastern times. It's lined up with Uranus, which may rattle the energy on Friday morning. We may be a bit unsettled. There may be just some emotional upset or just some excitement that, Uranus isn't necessarily negative. It's just destabilizing. It can feel like an adrenaline rush. It can feel very, very exciting. The odd thing is that moon lining up with Uranus is juxtaposed against a Venus trine Saturn later in the morning on Friday. And that Venus trine Saturn is more about steadying our desires and our likes, our attractions. This is a great day to take care of financial situations, to think about money, budgeting, financial planning. It's also a day where attention to relationships may not be on edge and exciting. The attention we put toward relationships is really about firming them up, about creating longevity, about making things last. And I think that this is a very powerful day for that. Although, again, communication can run into, I don't want to say trouble, but it can stir up more than we intend, because by late this evening, Mercury forms a quincunx with Pluto, and that actually can bring up to the surface perhaps more than we intended. Maybe not more in quantity, but more in quality, deeper, more intense, more extreme energy comes up to the surface, and then once again we need to contend with what the impact of our words may be. As we move into June, the Gemini energy continues to develop. In fact, on June 2nd, the moon moves into Gemini, heading toward a new moon on June 3rd. We'll talk more about that in the June overview, which will be out by June 1st. I think all in all here, it's interesting that we had so much stuff going on the first part of this month. And in some ways, the full moon on the 18th, in some ways, really is a culmination. It's a bit of a turning point. It's about digging deep. It's about going underneath the surface to gather the missing information in order to bring it up into awareness so that we can do something with it. And I think as we move closer towards the end of the month and on into June, as the energy moves from Taurus into Gemini, I think the energy lightens a little bit. There's more information that is coming out into the open. More energy is flowing around. Gemini is the time of year when bugs appear in the air, when leaves become, there's things floating in the air. It's like seasonally in the northern hemisphere, Aries is the beginning of spring, and Taurus is when the twigs and things get substance. It's like the wood, the structure grows. But by the time the sun is in Gemini, and here Mercury also in Gemini, by the time that occurs, and then with the moon moving into Gemini, the beginning of June, toward that new moon, it's like this is the real part of spring where things are really happening, and we're edging closer and closer towards the summer. So in retrospect, I think the important thing here is to use the energy of the middle of the month to bring up as much stuff as we can out into the open, so that we have grist for the mill as we work on increasing consciousness through the end of the month. I'm Rick Levine. I'll see you for the month ahead in June in just a couple of weeks.